Evan, did you want to try sharing your screen and like going through a couple of slides to make sure it works?
Yeah, that sounds good.
I mean, now that we're getting to the last presentation, we finally figured out all the troubleshooting we have to do.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. I can see it and it's advancing.
Okay, great.
Hey, Evan.
Tech check.
Do you hear Spencer?
Oh, hey, Spencer. You're on the edge of the owl's eye.
Yeah.
One of the eyes.
Are you going to enlighten us as to the origin of the name?
Yeah. Well, maybe at the end we can talk about that. I don't
Okay.
have it in the slides.
Uh,
Can you still see what I'm sharing, or did it disappear?
yeah, I can see it.
Okay, good. For those in the atrium, I'm gonna have a couple points where I'm gonna ask people to respond in the chat. So
Okay,
how the best way to do that might be, if people want to join on a personal device or just shout out and Ebony can put responses down. I think either way it would be great, but I just
Okay.
wanted to give people a heads up.
maybe I'll just sit by the computer then.
How many words can you type per minute?
Probably not enough, but
Okay.
this isn't too much of a heckling audience, so I think I can keep up. Okay, we got a couple more people coming, Evan, but I think just about any time you want to get started, it should be okay.
Okay. If I put the chat here, can you all see that on the screen?
No,
Okay.
but we can pull up the chat on our end.
Yeah, I want to make sure people can see what other people are sharing in the chat. So for the folks in the atrium, maybe you
Okay.
can help me with that, Ebony, since I don't think
Yep.
it's gonna go up.
Yep, I've got the chat up now.
All right. Well, thank you all for being here. Ebony, thank you so much for coordinating all of this. It's been a great series, and I'm really looking forward to what I hope will be season 2 after this summer. Today, I'm going to be talking about perennial Baki bean nutrition, functionality, and food system integration. I want to start by thanking the PAP for funding for my position to do this work. Also those in the legume program, crop stewardship and communications. And then at Washington State University, we have a collaboration with food scientists there that has contributed a lot to the work I'm going to share today. And then I want to highlight our grower collaborators, Raleigh and Jennifer Schleep and Sean and Allison Wenzel. They have an impressive amount of experience and knowledge working with sandfoin, which is the crop that the perennial Baki bean comes from. And we've learned a lot from them. So I just want to acknowledge their contributions. This is an overview of what I'll be presenting today. I'm going to ask everyone to wait until the end for questions. Hopefully we'll have some time for some good discussion, but I'm going to situate this work within some context and define some things so that the terms I'm using are going to be a little bit more accessible, hopefully. Then I'll talk about our GRASS data set, or generally recognized as safe, food science collaborations, how that ties into food system integration and breeding strategies for Baki, and then end with some concluding thoughts. And I mentioned this starting out, but in the chat, I'm hoping some people can share what comes to mind when you hear quinoa. So I'll give you all about a minute, maybe, to put some responses in the chat. And just what comes to mind when you hear quinoa, if you're familiar with it. I worked on quinoa as one of the crops for my dissertation, which was focused on breeding for end-use quality in quinoa and malting barley. Okay, some good responses. Thank you all. So gluten-free grain, commercial, whole food, superfood, pseudo-grain, expensive cold salad, alternative to rice, Peru, Andes, healthy, protein, expensive. Some comments on the texture, different ways to use it. And I think that this is common for most people who are familiar with quinoa. What comes to mind first might be the nutrition. But in working with quinoa, what really fascinated me was the genetic diversity present in quinoa. And this has come from thousands of years of farmer-maintained land races. And because of that genetic diversity, quinoa has an incredible ability to adapt to different agroecological conditions and extreme environments. So for example, growing from sea level to up to 3,000 meters above sea level, being able to grow on salt flats, really high salinity soils, and tolerant of drought, frost. But when we think of quinoa, it's all focused on the nutrition and not as much these environmental benefits. So to compare this to perennial grain crops, I think right now we're leading a lot with the environmental benefits, which are remarkable. And as this emerging work that I'm going to be highlighting today with Baki demonstrates the nutritional benefits and different applications, I'll make the argument that we should also be leading with nutrition. And I hope that over time, we're going to be able to strengthen the claims that we can make around nutrition, because the goal is to have these perennial grain crops sustain us and nourish us. And you don't just have to take my word for it. This is some consumer survey data from the Hartman Group, really focused on plant-based eating as far as the responses. just to introduce you to the figure here, the responses are broken out into these different categories for these different food technologies. So our work may relate most to the responses for regenerative agriculture. And what I want you to take away from this slide is the strongest purchase drivers for consumers are focused in this bin here, health related. This is before ethics, experience, other reasons. So leading with health is what some companies are really targeting for their products. And health can be really subjective and specific to each individual, but there are indicators of health tied to specific nutrients that we get from our diet. And people are seeking to increase fiber and protein in their diets, as well as whole grains and whole foods. So thinking about perennial grain crops, how can they deliver these nutrients? And throughout this presentation today, I'm really going to be focusing on fiber and on protein. So protein, this figure here is from the World Resources Institute. They're creating a sustainable food future report from July of 2019. What it's showing on the y-axis here is the grams consumed per capita per day. This line here is the average daily protein requirement. And it should be clear that in most parts of the world, we're getting enough protein. But at least in the United States, I want to highlight that from some USDA data gathered in 2012, which is in this report, US adults are consuming about 2/3 more protein than is required each day, while at the same time, about 1/4 of adults are considering themselves deficient in protein. So there's a bit of a disconnect in terms of what we think we need and what we're getting, perhaps. And so why are we seeing this overconsumption of protein? Most people might be familiar with this shift in diets towards more animal-based protein sources from a plant-based protein diet. And that's really what I think is driving this overconsumption. There are a lot of environmental effects of producing all of those animal-based protein sources. And there are also a lot of environmental effects of this excessive protein consumption. And the P4P people might be excited about this because this could be a good intervention for them to collect, the phosphorus and the nitrogen that's just getting, washed through us from all of this excess protein. I'm going to talk a little bit now about dietary fiber. So for those that aren't familiar with that dietary fiber, there are two forms, insoluble and soluble. These are the foods they typically come from, and they have different benefits in the body. Now, this is in contrast to protein because dietary fiber has been a nutrient of concern since 2005, and this is from the Dietary Guidelines for Americans. So the current ones are looking out to 2025. And at current rates, over 90% of women and 97% of men are not meeting the dietary fiber intake. So this is referred to as the fiber gap, and it's huge. Almost all of the population is not getting enough dietary fiber. Now, why is this? It's mostly because of underconsumption of these foods here. So 85% adults are not consuming enough fruits, vegetables, whole grains. Now, why does this matter? There is an overwhelming body of evidence, clinical trials, other medical studies that demonstrate that intakes of fiber are associated with lower risks of all-cause cardiovascular and cancer mortality. So we're not consuming enough fiber, while at the same time, there's so much evidence that shows all the benefits of consuming fiber. So this is a huge challenge, and there's a lot of ground to make up here when we think of the fiber gap. So how does protein and fiber relate to pulses? Now, Baki is the perennial pulse at the Land Institute. Pulses are a nutritional package that have both protein and fiber. So in consuming them, we can help meet those requirements from one food source. The challenge, though, is that pulses are generally underconsumed in the US. So on some data from the study here, 2017, the beans, lentils, and peas, less than 5% are consumed on a daily basis. Excuse me, less than 5% of people are consuming them on a daily basis. And if you think about the fiber gap, it's not a coincidence that the population meeting the fiber requirements are, there are also those that are consuming pulses. So if you're consuming pulses daily as part of your diet to meet the protein requirement, you're also probably meeting the fiber requirement. There are also levels of consumption per day that are associated with demonstrated nutritional and disease prevention benefits. So this is some of the messaging around pulses tied to protein and fiber. So just to summarize the context, I want to reiterate that as we mature the body of evidence we have on the nutrition of perennial grain crops, we should be leading with nutrition. Protein and fiber are important nutrients to focus on because of the context I provided on those previous slides, and the pulses provide both, and they're underconsumed. So there's a challenge there. So this is the motivation and interest that I'm bringing to the work with Baki. And so my position as a postdoctoral researcher in the legume program is focused on understanding the potential utility of sandfoin as a pulse crop and preparing for Baki to enter human food systems. Some definitions, I mentioned grass, so this is generally recognized as safe. I'm going to talk more about this. Perennial Baki bean in this panel here is from the plant sandfoin. The pod you can see in this photo, there's a single seed in each pod. And when we talk about the seeds, on the left here, we have the whole seeds with the seed coat, and on the right, we have the split seeds. Hopefully left and right is working on your screen, but I just wanted to define this so that when I use these terms later, you can think back to this slide and have a visual in mind. There are 4 objectives that my position is structured by. The first is to broadly explore sandfoin seed composition. The second is to explore opportunities and barriers for sandfoin seeds and seed products and food systems. The third is to then initiate conversations with food companies and processors and encourage them to conduct R&D to potentially utilize Baki. And then the fourth is to develop methods for improving Baki nutritional or functional attributes through breeding. I'm going to go through each of these objectives. So the first objective, broadly explore sandfoin seed composition. This work is really tied to securing generally recognized as safe status for Baki, or the seed from sandfoin. And this is right from the USDA. So what do we need to do to get grass? We either need to show through published studies that it's safe to consume, or corroborate and expand on those studies through our own data. And because there's limited literature on the nutritional quality of Baki, or excuse me, sandfoin seeds, we had to generate that data set. And so I want to also acknowledge Brandon for having the foresight to build these data sets that I've been able to work with. Now, as far as nutritional quality in grass, this is a nice framework that is from Dr. James House at the University of Manitoba, who does a lot of pulse nutritional quality work. When we think of nutritional quality, there are these different bins that we can collect evidence in. And they get more complex the further along that you go. So I'll just use this protein quality. We have to understand digestibility, but also amino acid composition. So when you think of the grass data set, we have information in these different bins. And that has been all brought together to make the case that Baki is safe to eat. Another way to look at this data set is what I'm showing here. So for those that may not be familiar, sandfoin is used as a forage crop already. So there are commercially available named varieties for the forage industry. There are individuals producing seed for people to plant sandfoin as a forage. And so the data set is really built on these forage varieties, the seed companies that are producing them, and the samples come from their commercial seed lots. And all of the analyses were conducted with the whole seed. So think back to the image with the seed coats, the darker seeds. We have about 9 to 15 seed samples per analyte. And we have 107 analytes, and this is another way to bin the data. And today I'm just going to be focusing on the protein and amino acids and then the dietary fiber. Okay, this is where I'm going to ask you for some responses here. So crude protein content, we have soybean at the top and we have chickpea at the bottom. So in the chat, let me know where you think Baki falls. There are 6 slots here, and I'm curious to see where people think Baki falls. Take maybe 30 seconds because you only have to type one number. We have 1, 2, 2, 4, 3, 3, another 2, 3, 1. Okay. On the big reveal here. Okay, so Baki, based on our grass data set, falls just below soybean, which is really exciting to see. These are most of the other pulse crops down here. They have about 20 to 30% protein, and what we have with our preliminary data is that Baki is about 35 to 40% protein. So this is the protein content. We want to also understand the protein composition, and we look to the amino acid profile to understand that. So this figure here is showing Baki in this color here. For each of the essential amino acids, there is a daily requirement established by the Food and Agriculture Organization and the World Health Organization. There are 9 essential amino acids, and what we see from our grass data set is that Baki is meeting the requirements for each of the amino acids. And I want to note that pulses are often limited by these sulfur amino acids, and you can see the breakdown here where these are not meeting the requirements. And this is really exciting, but this is just one piece of the protein quality puzzle. So we have the composition of the amino acids, and I'm going to talk about this protein quality puzzle later on. Now, dietary fiber, I'm not going to have you guess where Baki falls. It is extremely high in dietary fiber. It's about 30% insoluble fiber and 7% soluble fiber. Much higher than these other pulse crops, but very similar to lupin, actually. So from our grass data set, we have really exciting results to share about the protein, fiber, and a lot of other of those analytes as well. And this summer, the draft dossier, so this is the narrative on the safety of Baki, it will go to an expert panel for review. And if everything goes well in their analysis of the safety narrative, by the end of the summer or sometime during the summer, we'll likely have this self-GRAS status, which just means we've done our due diligence to establish the safety of Baki as a human food. And there's the option also then to go to the FDA, file for GRAS status with the FDA. Moving into the second objective now, which is focused on the seeds and seed products, how we can use them in the food system. And this is where I'll transition and talk more about the food science collaborations that I've been developing at Washington State University. So I did my PhD at Washington State. I worked at times with Dr. Grish Ganjal, who's shown here, on quinoa. So this is quinoa and some cookies they developed and to evaluate breeding lines. And Dr. Ganjal's PhD student, Elizabeth Nalbandian, has been training me in all these different food science tests and analyses. And the motivation here is to understand what is the inherent functionality of Baki flour from the whole and the split seeds. And for those that might not be familiar with functionality, there are a lot of different ways to characterize it. So there are these different tests that we do. And from these tests, we can then predict how the ingredient might perform in different applications. So these could range from use in a gravy or a salad dressing or a pudding to bread, quick breads, as an emulsifier, things like that. So this work is ongoing. I'll probably be finishing it this spring. So today I'm just going to share some results related to the protein content, and then also with the dietary fiber. So the crude protein content, this study has the whole and split seeds, like I mentioned, but we also have 4 varieties. And what we learned through the analysis of the crude protein content is that by removing that seed coat, we can increase the protein content from about 36% to 42%. And we also see some evidence for possible differences between the varieties, but these weren't necessarily grown in the same environment. So we haven't controlled as much as we can for the environmental influence here. So we need to follow this up and corroborate these results. But this is really exciting because if we want to increase the protein content in the flour, we can just remove the seed coat. Now, the dietary fiber, I'm going to show you a video here of what this looks like. It is quite a lengthy process to analyze the dietary fiber. And what's happening in this machine is a simulation of what would happen in our bodies. So there's a enzyme, 3 different enzyme phases breaking down proteins and carbohydrates. And then in this top bag is where the insoluble fiber will be collected. All the soluble fiber will be collected in the bag that's underneath. You can't really see it in this photo. I'm in the process of running these analyses right now. And so I'll have data in the future, but I just wanted to share what this looks like because I think it's really cool that it's a really interesting test to run and see, and we'll learn what the fiber content looks like between the whole and the split seeds. So from this work, I mentioned we can start to predict different applications for the flours. So I'm just using pasta here as an example. The goal is to have an ingredient that doesn't require additives to achieve the functionality needed in the product. So, for the middle one here, it's simply red lentil flour. Either the variety of the red lentil or the process that they're using is enough to achieve all the functionality needed to make a penne pasta. This is contrasted by the product here, which has chickpeas, and then they're adding tapioca as a starch, pea protein, and xanthan gum as an emulsifier. So those additives are bringing the functionality that the chickpeas don't inherently have. And then we can also see for the fava bean flour, there's white rice flour, cauliflower, and then these mono and diglycerides. So the idea here is to understand the functionality just of the Baki flour as itself. And then another application is in plant-based foods. And this is where I'll ask you in the chat to share, because I'm really curious to know if anyone has tried any of these products, if you're familiar with them, maybe you could put in the chat the brand that you've tried. If you don't see one up here that you've tried, please put it in the chat. It'll take maybe 30 seconds to get your responses here. Morningstar, Impossible, Oatly. Yeah, Oatly, I mean, they've really done it. Garden of Life, Ripple, Silk. Okay, so people, it seems like, yeah, people are pretty familiar with these. So this is really an application that we want to explore for Baki. companies get excited when they hear how much protein is in the Baki itself, because most of these products are made with protein extracted from the plant. So it's either a concentrate or an isolate of the protein. And most of these products right now are using soy, wheat, or pea. Pea is really getting a lot of research and development in this space. And when we think about perennial grain crops, we want to be competing with annuals to get them on the landscape, but this is another arena, if you will, to compete with annuals. If we can displace annuals as an ingredient in these products, I think that's going to be a success for perennial grains. So we need to do the research in collaboration with food companies to be able to understand the application here. And this is also a really big market, and it's going to be growing quite a bit over the next decade. And I just wanted to share some more consumer research motivations for trying these plant proteins. You can see that in these top 5 responses, 3 of them are related to health and wellness. And another way to think of this is taste and flavor as a main driver, and then cost and convenience. So those are important things to keep in mind as far as the success of getting perennial grains into this space. So how are we going to do this? We're going to be working with the Plant Protein Innovation Center at the University of Minnesota. We've worked with them to map out a 3-phased research direction to understand how to extract and characterize the protein from Baki. So this phase 1 will occur from probably June until December of this year. They'll take flour from the split seeds, so the seed coat will be removed. And if we rely on our preliminary data, we're going to be starting at about 42% protein. And then they'll go through and optimize 2 different protein extraction methods that are used in the industry to get from that 14% protein up to about 85% protein. Once they have the protein isolated, they'll characterize the structure and also the functionality. So if you think back to all those different products you're familiar with, based on the functionality of the protein, will determine what the applications can be. So the pasting and gelatinization, those and emulsification, those really go into the plant-based meat category. Solubility is going to determine how well it can go into beverages. Emulsification and capacity and stability is related a little bit to functionality in the alternative egg space. So I want you to think of, we can look at the functionality and then predict the applications. And the 3rd phase of this project is actually after scaling the extraction to then focus on application development. So I've talked about the nutrition of Baki, some of the functionality that we're learning. Now, how do we communicate this to food companies? How do we get them excited to work with Baki? And so these conversations are in collaboration with the legume program and with crop stewardship. We're also doing a lot of work around the trademark, so Baki itself, the branding and commercialization strategy. And we're developing communication materials. So my role has been to lead publication of the initial data sets that we have. We have 1 published in Legume Science. We have another article focused just on the amino acid and fatty acid profiles that's in review right now in Frontiers in Nutrition. And then we developed a use case analysis that was published with, or excuse me, has been shared with companies. It's a really nice way to communicate what we know about Sandfoin and Baki. And I've just shared a list of some of the companies that we've been talking with. In talking with these companies, there are a lot of questions that they have. I mean, as Baki matures into the market, these questions are probably going to change. But right now, there's a lot of questions around safety, nutrition, functionality. And I hope from what I've talked about, you can imagine how we're better prepared to answer these questions now by investing in this work. Moving forward for the presentation, I want to focus on this question here, which is related to the protein quality. Before moving into the protein quality, though, I wanted to share with you all 3 plant-based products. Maybe you're familiar with these. And then based on what I've been talking to you about today, I want to see, do you notice anything on these labels? I'm hoping you can share in the chat some observations on the product nutrition labels or on the front-facing label. So maybe take a minute to do that now.
Sorry, Evan, what were we supposed to notice?
Just share an observation that you have on these labels, just anything that stands out. It's a pretty open-ended request. I'm just curious to see what comes to mind for people. So people mentioning the fat, so that is certainly something that's being advertised on the front here, right? Less saturated fat. This is compared to the animal-based product. And then also what they're replacing. So maybe I can give a hint. We've been talking a lot about, or I've been talking to you a lot about protein and fiber. So what do you notice, if anything, about the protein and the fiber on these labels? Okay. Nutrition labels are hard to decipher. Yeah, overwhelming. And then you look at the ingredient list and it gets more complicated. Okay. Fiber varies, lots of protein, little fiber. So what I wanted to highlight from this is, even though the fiber seems low, if you look at an animal-based sausage, it will have 0 fiber usually. It's not contributing any fiber. So as an alternative, using these pulse crops in these products is bringing a lot of fiber. And the fiber piece is a little more complicated. We can discuss this more, but I just wanted to highlight that. And then I wanted to highlight that each of these products is reporting that they have 16 grams of protein. But then I wanted to draw your attention to the percent daily value. So they vary a little bit. And the reason for this is likely due to the protein quality. So I mentioned that the protein quality puzzle, just one piece of that is the amino acid composition. The other is digestibility and absorption. And ultimately, we want to know, can the protein source meet essential amino acid requirements? And just to be maybe a little more clear about this, in the product or the ingredient, whatever it is, when we eat it, the amino acids that are in it, they may not be able to be digested, or the proteins might not be able to be digested and absorbed by the body. And that's really where we see a difference between the animal-based proteins, which are generally of the highest quality, so up here in this figure, compared to the plant-based proteins. So a value of 1, all of these animal-based proteins are often exceeding this value of 1 in terms of their protein quality. The plant-based proteins, because they either have lower or limiting amino acids or lower digestibility of the protein, that is what's causing them to have lower values below this value of 1. So this protein quality piece, just to reiterate, is both the amino acid composition, and it's also based on the digestibility of the protein. And evidence of this allows us to support claims. So protein requirements vary by person, but generally a 50-gram recommended daily value is used. And I just wanted to show the label here for Kernza from Perennial Pantry. Excellent source of dietary fiber, 8 grams of protein, but no reported percent daily value. So when we really want to understand how perennial grain crops can deliver nutrition, we need to be understanding both the protein content, but also the composition and the digestibility, which allows us to understand the protein quality. And I think investing in this work will really lend legitimacy to perennial grain crops in this context. So now relating this to the breeding process, I'll just use the example here of what if we want to improve the protein content? From our preliminary data, we're likely going to see an increase in amino acids and also an increase in dietary fiber. There's some nuance here to explore. We'll probably be seeing a decrease in crude fat content, which is going to be beneficial for the plant-based protein applications because we need to remove that fat before we can isolate the protein. And then perhaps a decrease in phytic acid. And I haven't talked much about phytic acid, but it can inhibit protein digestibility. So it's part of that protein quality equation. And protein digestibility, if you think back to the question from the food companies, they were asking about the PDCAS. So this is the protein digestibility corrected amino acid score. It's a measure of the protein quality, as well as this newer method, the DIAS. These are animal-based models where this is measured. So they're expensive and there's also ethical concerns with them. So to understand protein digestibility, there are also in vitro methods. These are laboratory tests. They're cheaper and higher throughput, so they could likely be used as a comparative measure of protein digestibility. So you can think about that, how we might apply that in the breeding program for Baki at the advanced stages or through different trials, research trials, to see how protein digestibility might be impacted by different factors. But just to highlight some broad strategies here, we need to continue to build these nutritional quality data sets through monitoring. We can't just stop with what we have now and assume that that is the information that we can translate out into the world. We need to corroborate that information that we already have. We're developing high throughput phenotyping methods so that we can look at relationships between seed morphology and seed composition. Seed morphology is likely going to be easier to evaluate and select. And we can leverage these two pieces together to develop predictive models, which will improve evaluation and selection so we can make gains. Applying these strategies, we can better understand the factors that are influencing morphology, composition, and functionality, and understand the extent of variability. And then just scaling and applying in different contexts. And we can also look for sources of genetic diversity. So for these nutritional quality traits, we might want to be bringing in accessions that might have higher protein content or lower phytic acid, for example, so that we can improve protein quality. And then I also want to mention that this isn't just a breeding solution if we want to improve protein quality. Plant genetics are just one lever that we have available. After the plant comes out of the field, there's a lot that can happen that's going to impact the protein quality. Okay, getting to the end here. I know I've talked a lot about health, which is really specific and subjective to each person, and nutrition, which we can focus on certain components of. I think in general, though, I just want to leave you with this thought that we want to eat a small amount of many different things, and hopefully perennial grain crops will be part of these diets that we can use to nourish and sustain us. And then as we move into hopefully some discussion now, I just wanted to leave some food for thought. And with that, I'll thank you for your attention. And if anyone has questions or wants to discuss anything, let's do it.
Hey, we're unmuted, so if anybody has any questions in the atrium.
Can I ask?
Yeah.
Is there a speaker?
Yep, go ahead.
Hi, Evan. I just wondered, will you at some point look at other nutrients? You mentioned at the beginning things like minerals, vitamins, phytochemicals playing into that kind of nutrition definition. I'm interested to know how the Baki beans compare to, say, other legumes in maybe these other nutrient content.
Yeah, I had a little bit of a hard time hearing the question, but I think you were asking, when we think of nutritional quality, all those different bins that we can start collecting information in, how Baki compares to other pulses. And
Yeah, that's it. Yeah.
we have that included in the one study I mentioned that we've published in Legume Science that really focused on the macronutrient composition and also starch and some of the micronutrients as well. So to answer your question, we see that iron and zinc, for example, is within the range seen for other pulses. The phytic acid is high, so that's a challenge that we need to work on either through breeding or through processing and food and the preparation of Baki. We have, I shared the data on the amino acid profile. The fatty acid profile is mostly polyunsaturated fatty acids. The highest composition is for the omega-3 fatty acids. So that's kind of exciting to see. And then we have some data on L-cannabinine is one of the potential anti-nutrients that can accumulate in legumes. We don't see any evidence of that with our samples. And just to compare that, alfalfa has the L-cannabinine and other legumes in that part of the phylogeny or family tree, they can have cannabinine. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, thanks. And just as a follow-on, are those things accounted for in the breeding trials? Like, are there different varieties of the Baki beans that maybe have higher levels of, say, zinc, for example?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it really draws attention to the need to keep building on these data sets. A lot of what we learned is through the name varieties. And so we need to develop these tools so that we can evaluate these types of nutritional traits in the breeding lines and also the research trials. So that I think we're going to gain momentum in this direction as we start to apply those tools and learn more. And that's where the genetic diversity piece comes in as well. Once we have those tools and we can evaluate different types of sandfoin, we could look to see, can we incorporate them and breed in different directions based on the applications.
Couple of good questions in the chat, Evan.
Okay, Jacob had a question. Do you have a favorite food made with sandfoin or one that you're excited to be more widespread? My favorite is the photo here. So just soaking it, boiling it, and cooking it. The texture is really nice. It's a really forgiving pulse as far as cooking it. You know, some lentil market classes will just completely disintegrate when you cook them. Baki maintains this really nice texture when cooked. So, and I think this is a great, I mean, this would be a great whole food to see more people eating. I mean, we want to try to incorporate it into all these different products so that it's accessible to a greater proportion of the population. Tammy had a question about storage and shelf life. We actually just started a study on shelf life. So we have 2 partner companies that package the Baki in the whole and split seed in plastic and paper bags, and then also milled it to flour from the whole and split seeds and packaged it in paper and plastic. The flour everything is in ambient conditions, so what you might see in your home, and then also the flour is in refrigerated conditions. The flour will be measured for chemistry over a period of every 2 weeks to start, just to see if we see any rapid changes. The seed will be a 3-month interval, and the idea is to I mean, the proposal is to go out for, I think, a year and a half, but we'll just kind of learn as we go and see what the changes look like. Brandon has a question. Easily digestible protein really necessary in the US? Yeah. Okay. I think that's a really good question. It ties back to this overconsumption of protein piece. You know, if there's 30 grams of protein, 30% protein in Baki, but we can only digest and utilize a certain percent, is that okay? I think that's a great question. I don't know if anyone else has thoughts on that.
I guess one thought I might have is that, you know, if Americans are going to overconsume protein anyway, then it's going to be environmentally better to be overconsuming plant protein than it is to be overconsuming animal protein.
I think
So-
the only issue is if you can't digest it, you don't just not absorb the protein, you don't also absorb the sort of the beneficial nutrients, but.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we still have, we haven't collected any data yet on the protein digestibility. We haven't budgeted for the next financial year in Brandon's program, so hopefully we can learn more. The idea is to understand it in the various cooked methods and see how that might change the protein digestibility.
Evan, isn't the issue too, is that protein digestibility will determine, based on the type of research you do, will determine if we can say things like good source, better source, excellent source.
Yes, it does play into that. And that's why I highlighted the Kernza packaging related to that slide that evidence supports claims. So we do need to do that work. And I think the question is like, is that our responsibility to do, or is it should food companies be doing that? Do we want to lead in that space, or do we want to leave it to others to lead? So that is thoughts that I have on that piece. I mean, I think we should endeavor to understand that so that we can communicate the value of perennial grain crops in that way. Looks like Gina had a question on taste. So soy is a popular protein source because it has a neutral taste. Yeah, we can investigate taste through sensory science, either with consumers or people who are trained to detect and compare the flavor and aroma of Baki to other proteins. We're likely to see the flavor impacted by the high amount of the unsaturated fatty acids that are in Baki. So the oxidation of the lipids will give rise to some compounds that are characteristic of a beanie flavor that are common to most pulses that some people don't like. So we still have more to learn beyond just anecdotal evidence about flavor. I'm reading Aubrey's comment now. Question about that. Those are great thoughts, Aubrey. Thank you. There was a question about the trademark versus an R. I don't know if Tessa's on the call, but maybe I can open it up. Have Tessa share.
Yeah, so we can't use the R until we have filed for intent to use registration. So that's the difference. We're in the process, but we haven't, it's not a registered trademark yet. So we can use the TF for now. And then once we've filed, then we can use the R. And don't worry, I'll let everyone know when we switch.
So while we're talking about the name, can you explain like where the name came, like what the name means? Why Baki?
Just for reference, everyone, there's Spencer posted a big thing about it on the TLI newsfeed if you want the full story, but.
Is Spencer in the atrium? Spencer, do you want to share? I mean, I keep talking, but just to open it up, I'd love to hear Spencer talk about it, the name.
Sure, so there were some suggestions on, names through surveys and just general, in the consortium of people talking about it, and we wanted something that, paid homage to, where Sandpoint came from, and some of our collaborators in the Mediterranean area in Turkey. The scientific name is Sonobricus vistifolia. And one name that came out of that was like Brica. And that was kind of close, and then Baki kind of came out of that. It happened to have some loose translation to long living or perennial in Turkish.
Maybe, I'm wondering if, I guess, Evan, if you could comment on the goals of the trademark, if it's similar to what happened with Kernza, if the trademark is being sought for particular reasons.
Yeah, I can share my understanding, and then maybe Tessa and Brandon, maybe Tammy too can share. So I think the commercialization strategy for Sandpoint is a little bit different than Kernza, because we have the close relationships with the commercial seed producers. So I acknowledge them at the beginning. And I think the trademark is to allow us to have the identity preservation and to also have control on how the seeds from Sandpoint can be used. And we've done a lot of work to demonstrate the safety of that. So I think that's also wrapped up in the trademark as well. Tessa and Brandon, do you have any additional thoughts that you want to share?
Yeah, I think that's a good summary, Evan. And one thing that's really has been important is thinking about keeping like being able to have sort of an identity preserved process so that we know what that the grain is being grown and the quality and things like that we can kind of track and understand that. And then of course there's like market differentiation is a big piece of it, and making sure that companies can differentiate it in the marketplace. But another piece that I think is important is also that we want to be able to make sure that we I don't know, scale. This is quite different than Kernza in the sense that there are many acres of Sandpoint that could be harvested for a grain crop right now, but there's not a market for the grain. So we really need to focus on building that market space and a market identity for Sandpoint prior to there being like a huge amount available in terms of supply. So that's a big part of it too, is just making sure that there is market recognition and an available market space. And we want to offer the licensing is going to be quite different from Kernza. So there will be a lot of differences in terms of the commercialization plan that we use. Tammy, do you have anything else you want to add?
Just that, I mean, similar to Kernza, this is our way, our not perfect way of maintaining a research connection to the crop, in addition to helping steward the market in a defensive posture, so that it, we continue to evolve the research side of this, because we have many years before we're going to hit 1 million acres. So we want to make sure that we are tied to the work in a specific way.
Yeah, and also we don't want to like flood the market with, hundreds of growers who immediately like start producing sandpoint seed and there's no processing or there's nowhere to sell it or the price ends up at 1 cent a pound, and those kinds of things are really important.
Are there any lessons that can be learned from the hemp industry?
You mean some things to avoid? Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think Kernza's has run the risk of going the way of hemp more than Sandpoint will, just because I think we have a different method to approach commercialization for Sandpoint, because there are already acres in the ground. There's no need to expand the acres at this point. It's really just about market expansion and working really closely with the growers that we know that already are good at producing Sandpoint seed, so that we can move that seed into the grain market for Baki, and keep an eye on the quality and things like that too. So.
All right, well, let's thank Evan again, and yeah.
Thank you all.
Thank you, Evan.
Thanks, Evan.
Thank you, everybody, for attending the research seminar series. Evans was the last talk before the summer season, so we will be starting up presentations again in the fall, probably sometime in October. Please feel free to contact me and let me know if you want to give a presentation. Thanks.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. Bye.